Hi, this lesson in cost analysis is about fixed and variable costs. Let's take a look at the difference between these two types of costs. First, fixed costs are those costs that basically are constant regardless of the number of people you're serving or regardless of the volume of your service. We actually talked about this in one of the previous examples. Remember the church camp, in which some of those costs were fixed. In fact, the fixed costs in those cases were the things like renting the camp, renting the bus, and then the variable costs were those costs that varied according to the number of kids we were serving in that camp. In this case, it was things like the number of meals that we had. The average cost of the meal would go up. The total cost of the meal would go up as we served more kids, as well as the equipment. Now here's a couple of examples. Let's do a little quiz here. So remember, don't really raise your hand when you do this, but answer along at home. So is this a fixed or a variable cost? Salaries. Well, if you said it depends, that's always right, of course. But I'm gonna press you a little to explain why that's a right answer. Actually, it is in almost all cases a fixed cost, and the reason is it doesn't matter how many people you're serving. Salaries are paid whether you're busy or not, so it's a cost that remains fixed. How about supplies? Well, in this case, it's almost always variable, just by definition. The more people that are using that service, the more supplies you go through, because supplies are expendables. Things like food, things like number of canoes you need if you're serving more of those kids on that church camp. Okay, how about rent? That is almost always fixed, but there are some variations there. Obviously, if you're serving a lot of people, you might need to rent more space, but it tends to go up in chunks rather than smoothly. So for the most part, that is a fixed expense. Here's something that the economists will like. In fact, this whole cost analysis is going to be near and dear to the those with econ backgrounds in the class, because I have lots of charts and graphs to explain that. So here's the typical chart when we're showing cost, and then the number of people we're serving, the number of units of service along the bottom. So here's a graph that graphs the cost depending on whether we're serving 5 people or 10 or 15. So would this be a fixed or a variable cost? Well, if you answered fixed, that's correct, because the fixed costs do not vary with the volume. So whether you're serving 5 people, it still costs you $20. Whether you're serving 20 people, it still costs you $20. And then, by deduction, because you're bright people here, this would be the variable cost, because as you serve more people, the number of costs, the cost go up. Now I show it going off of the point where the fixed costs start, because it's additive. The total costs that you're looking at are the sum of both fixed costs and variable costs. So you can see if you're serving 20 people, your total costs are going to be about $40, and if you're serving no people, your costs are going to be about $20, because that's your fixed cost. Here's an example that's maybe a little closer to home. So let's take a look at this. Since we've already talked about direct and indirect costs, and now we've just talked about fixed and variable costs, let's take a couple examples and see where this would fall on this spectrum. So if you're the University of Minnesota, where would instructors fall on this? Which of those quadrants would be? I'll give you a minute to think about that. Well, if you said here, that was correct. It's a variable cost, and the reason it's a variable cost is that the number of total students we have will determine how many instructors we need. People like me that are basically on contract kind of ebb and flow depending on how many total instructors. Remember, this is from the perspective of the total University of Minnesota, not just one individual instructor. And it's also a direct cost, because I think it would be tough to argue that instructors are not directly related to the mission of the university, which is to educate people. So that's a direct and a variable cost. How about the administration? So where does the president of the university fall? Well, if you said fixed and indirect, you were correct here because it's a fixed cost. I mean, we have a university president, regardless if we have half the number of students or have double the number of students. Now we have it does ebb and flow a little, but for the most part, it is a fixed cost unless it's dramatically different. It's also indirect. I mean, think overhead. Remember, the boss is always overhead. How about classrooms? So where would they fall? Well, here's the answer for classrooms. It's a fixed cost in that we have a fixed number of classrooms, and unless we tear down a building or shutter a building, we have to pay for those classrooms, and so that is a fixed cost. And I think arguably that is a direct cost with association. Although the way this course is being taught, I guess this is the forerunner to making classrooms less of a fixed cost, since we'll have a less need if this sort of approach catches on. And what about maintenance? Where would that fall? Or utilities? That would be another example. So where would that fall? Yeah, if by deduction you took a logic course, that's the last quadrant that hasn't been addressed. So, but aside from that, the reason it is indirect because much like the administration, it's only indirectly related to education. You don't need maintenance to teach. So it's indirectly related to the cost of education. And also, it's a variable cost because the number of students we have, that determines how many classrooms we need and what the cost of those utilities are. We can we don't have to pay for those. You can see this is a little bit of gray. There's not necessarily a black and white. It involves some interpretation, but I hope you get the general idea of how to analyze these fixed and variable and direct and indirect costs. There it is all together. So that's it for this lesson. Be sure to answer the questions, and thank you again for listening.